The shovel bit into the earth with a sound like a dull tooth. Elias felt the familiar shudder travel up the hickory handle and into his arms, a vibration that had become the rhythm of his days. He shifted his weight, leveraged the blade, and tossed a heavy clod of dark topsoil onto the growing mound beside the excavation. Beside him, Boro, a shepherd mix with one floppy ear and eyes the color of old amber, lifted his head from his paws, tracked the arc of dirt, and then settled again with a soft sigh. The dog had learned weeks ago that this was not a game. This was work. The hole was already a testament to a singular, consuming purpose. It measured 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, its sides cut with a precision that defied the raw tools Elias used. He was 5 feet down, standing on a sublayer of dense, red clay that held the morning's coolness. He was 19 years old, and the property, 160 acres of rolling hills and stubborn timber, was all he had left after the fever took his parents the winter before. His inheritance was the land, a small, drafty farmhouse, and a collection of his father's journals bound in cracked leather. It was the journals that had led him here, to this patch of high ground 100 yards from the house, digging a hole that was becoming the subject of quiet speculation and outright mockery in the valley. Mr. Gable, his nearest neighbor to the west, was the most vocal. He'd stopped his wagon on the road a week ago, a position from which he could survey the growing absurdity of Elias's project. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" he had called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Elias had paused, one hand on the shovel, and wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He looked at the older man, whose face was a roadmap of hard-won conventional wisdom. "Building," Elias answered, his voice quiet. "Building what? A grave for a giant?" Gable chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You're digging a hole, son. There's nothing to build down there but trouble. The first good rain will turn that into a mud pit. Wait until winter. The ground will freeze 3 feet deep and crush whatever foolishness you're planning." Elias didn't argue. He had learned from his father that you could not win a debate against a man who had already made up his mind. You could only show him. "I have a plan," he said, and the simple finality of it left no room for discussion. Gable had just shaken his head, clucking his tongue. "That father of yours, he was a dreamer. Filled your head with nonsense, I see. Books and strange ideas. That's no way to survive out here. You survive with what's known, what's tested." He slapped the reins, and the wagon creaked away, leaving a cloud of dust and disapproval in its wake. Elias had gone back to digging. He knew what Gable and the others thought. They saw a grieving orphaned boy lost in a fool's errand. They didn't see the meticulous diagrams in his father's journals. They didn't understand the principles of geothermal stability, of using the earth itself as insulation. His father had been an engineer back east before he'd sought the quiet of the mountains, and he had filled his journals not with poetry, but with physics, with load-bearing calculations, with designs for structures that worked with the land instead of fighting it. He had called this one the hibernaculum, a winter-safe place, a place that could passively maintain a temperature between 50 and 70 degrees, regardless of the howling blizzard or scorching sun outside, using nothing but the planet's thermal mass and a clever ventilation system. The sun climbed higher, and the clay at Elias's feet began to lose its morning cool. Boro shifted into the shade cast by the mound of excavated earth. The physical toll was immense. Elias's hands, already calloused from a life of farm work, had developed new, deeper calluses that sometimes split and bled. His back was a column of fire by day's end, his shoulders a knot of screaming muscles. But the work was a meditation. Each shovelful was a tribute to his father's mind, a physical manifestation of his inherited knowledge. He wasn't just digging a hole, he was building a sanctuary, proving a theory that everyone else called madness. He would scoop, lift, turn, and throw. The rhythm was his prayer. The sweat was his offering. He had a plan. It would work. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The hole reached its prescribed depth of 10 feet. Now the real construction began. He spent a fortnight hauling fieldstone from the creek bed a half-mile away, using a simple stone boat sled pulled by the family's aging mule, Patience. He moved tons of rock, one load at a time, his muscles straining with the effort. Mr. Gable saw him dragging the loaded sled up the hill, his body bent almost double with the strain. "Going to build yourself a castle dungeon now, are you?" he'd yelled, a mocking grin on his face. Elias had just nodded, not breaking his stride. He laid the stones without mortar, a dry stack method his father had detailed with geometric precision. He chose each rock for its shape, fitting them together like pieces of an intricate puzzle, creating retaining walls that were 4 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet at the top. The work was slow, painstaking. A single misplaced stone could compromise the integrity of the whole wall. He would place a stone, step back, study it, and often remove it to find a better fit. Boro would watch, his head cocked, occasionally whining softly as if to question the boy's obsessive patience. But Elias worked on, his silence a testament to his focus. During this time, he had another visitor. Clara, the miller's daughter, sometimes walked the road on her way to gather wild herbs in the upper meadows. Unlike the others, she didn't mock. She stood at the edge of the pit, her brow furrowed with genuine curiosity. "What is it you're making?" she asked, her voice soft. Elias, perched on his half-finished wall, looked at her. He'd seen her in town, but they had never spoken more than a handful of words. "A house," he said. "An underground house." She peered down at the meticulous stonework. "How will it stay dry? My uncle's root cellar floods every spring." "It's on high ground," Elias explained, finding it easier to talk to her than to anyone else. "And there will be a drainage system. French drains around the perimeter, filled with gravel. The roof will be waterproofed." He pointed to the drawings he kept protected in an oilcloth wrap. "It's all designed." She studied the drawings, her eyes tracing the clean lines of the cross-sections. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood the care that had gone into it. "It's methodical," she said, handing them back. "My father says you're wasting your time. He says you should just be fixing the roof on your farmhouse." "The farmhouse roof can be patched," Elias said, turning back to his wall. "This is for the deep winter, the kind that breaks things." Clara didn't say anything for a long moment. She just watched him select a flat, heavy stone and maneuver it into place. "Be careful," she said finally, and continued on her way. Her visit was a small island of understanding in a sea of doubt, and Elias held on to it. The most powerful voice of skepticism belonged to Mr. Sterling, who owned the lumber mill and held the deeds to half the valley. He was a man who saw the world in board feet and profit margins. He rode his fine horse right up to the edge of the pit one afternoon, looking down at Elias as if from a great height. "Gable tells me you've lost your senses, son," Sterling said, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. He says you're trying to live in a hole like a badger. This is a foolish spectacle. It lowers the tone of the entire valley. An eyesore. It won't be an eyesore when it's done, Elias replied, not looking up. You won't even see it. I'd better not. Now, I knew your father, a smart man with books, but not much practical sense. I hope you haven't inherited that flaw. There's a bad winter coming. The old-timers feel it in their bones. The squirrels are hoarding more nuts. The bark on the trees is thicker. You should be salting meat and stacking firewood in that leaky farmhouse, not playing in the dirt. I am preparing, Elias said, his voice flat. Sterling snorted. This isn't preparation. This is madness. When the first blizzard hits and you're freezing in this ditch, you'll remember my words. He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving Elias in the quiet company of Boro and the stones. The walls were finished by late summer. Now came the most difficult part, the roof. He felled 10 mature pines from his woodlot, trees his father had marked years ago. He squared them into massive 12-inch by 12-inch beams using a broadaxe and an adze, work that left him exhausted and covered in resin. Getting the beams into place over the 20-foot span was a problem of leverage and patience. He built a ramp and, using the mule and a system of ropes and rollers, painstakingly winched each beam up and across the stone walls, setting them 3 feet apart. The final beam settled into its notch with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed across the hillside. He stood back, looking at the skeleton of the roof, a grid of immense strength against the sky. For the first time, it looked less like a hole and more like a shelter. He laid a subroof of thick, rough-sawn planks, caulking the seams with pine pitch he'd rendered himself. On top of that, he layered sheets of treated oilcloth, overlapping them like shingles. Then came the most laborious task of all, returning the earth. He built another ramp, and for 6 straight weeks, he moved the mountain of excavated dirt, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, up onto the roof. He packed it down, creating a dense, 3-foot-thick layer of earth that would serve as the primary insulation. He saved the topsoil for last, spreading it evenly and seeding it with the same grasses that grew on the surrounding meadow. When he was done, the structure had all but vanished. From a distance, it looked like a natural rise in the land, a small, grassy knoll. The only visible signs of the dwelling were a heavy oak door set into a stone entryway at one end and 2 stone chimneys, each 4 feet high, positioned 30 feet apart. These were not for smoke. They were the lungs of the house. As his father's journal explained, one was a cool air intake, the other a warm air exhaust. The temperature differential between the deep earth and the outside air would create a slow, constant passive air current, a thermal siphon that would keep the air inside fresh without creating a draft. It was the design's most elegant and most doubted feature. Inside, the space was cavernous and cool. The air smelled of damp earth, stone, and freshly cut wood. He built a stone hearth and chimney for cooking and supplemental heat at one end, and partitioned off a small sleeping area at the other. He furnished it simply with the sturdy furniture his father had built: a bed, a table, 2 chairs. He ran a stovepipe from a small cast-iron stove up the chimney flue. He dug his root cellar into one of the earth walls, where the temperature would remain a constant 40 degrees. By the first frost of October, he was moved in. He and Boro slept in the quiet, subterranean dark, the silence absolute. The farmhouse stood empty, a monument to a way of life he was leaving behind. The people of the valley noted his move with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "Wait until the snows come," became the common refrain. "Wait until the ground freezes solid." Mrs. Gable, a woman with a perpetually worried expression, had even brought him a jar of preserves and a thick wool blanket. "You'll need this, Elias," she'd said, avoiding looking into the dim interior of the shelter. "A body needs sunlight. It's not natural, living underground." "It's warm," he'd told her, "and it's safe." She had just shaken her head, sadly, as if he were a lost cause. As autumn deepened, the signs Mr. Sterling had spoken of became more pronounced. The winds had a sharper bite. The migrations of geese were larger and more frantic than anyone could remember. The first snows came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon, but the cold lingered. Elias stacked his firewood high beside the door and spent his days securing the last of his supplies. He felt a quiet sense of readiness, a calm certainty that was the opposite of the anxious energy buzzing through the valley. The farmers rushed to bring in their last harvests. The ranchers reinforced their barns. They were preparing for a fight. Elias felt as though he had already declared a truce. One afternoon, Clara came by again, a small basket in her hand. "My mother sent a loaf of bread," she said, handing it to him. "She's worried about you." "She doesn't need to be," Elias said, taking the still warm loaf. The scent of yeast and hearth filled the cool air of his entryway. Can I see inside?" Clara asked, her curiosity finally winning out over her reticence. Elias hesitated for a moment, then nodded and pushed the heavy door open wider. He lit an oil lamp, and the soft yellow light filled the space, glinting off the stone walls and the smooth-planed wooden furniture. The air inside was still and noticeably warmer than the biting wind outside. Clara stepped in, her eyes wide. She ran a hand along the cool, solid stone of the wall. She looked at the neatly stacked shelves, the small, efficient stove, the bed covered with thick quilts. "It's peaceful," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "It doesn't feel like a cave at all. It feels solid, safe." She walked to the center of the room and looked up at the massive beams overhead. "You did all this yourself." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of awe. "Boro helped," Elias said, and the dog, hearing his name, thumped his tail against the packed earth floor. Clara smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression. "Mr. Gable says the weight of the snow will crush it." "The beams can hold 4 feet of wet, heavy snow. The earth on top will insulate it, not crush it," Elias said, echoing his father's notes. "The snow will become part of the shelter." She looked at him, at his quiet confidence, and she believed him. "I hope you're right, Elias," she said as she left. "I truly do." By the second week of December, the cold was a physical entity. It was a predator that stalked the valley. The river froze over, thicker than anyone had seen in a decade. The trees were brittle, their branches cracking in the wind with sounds like pistol shots. The sky took on a permanent, bruised gray pallor. Boro grew restless, pacing the length of the shelter and whining softly at the door, his senses telling him something was wrong with the world outside. Elias kept the stove burning low, a small fire of seasoned oak that took the chill from the air. He checked the thermometer he'd hung by the door. Outside, 12 degrees. Inside, a steady, comfortable 68 degrees. The thermal siphon was working, pulling in the dense, cold air and passively warming it as it circulated through the stone and earth. He could feel the slow, silent exchange of energy, the house breathing around him. The blizzard began not with a fury, but with a whisper, A few stray flakes drifted down in the late afternoon, spiraling lazily in the still, heavy air. But as dusk fell, the wind began to rise, a low moan from the north that grew steadily in pitch and power. Elias stood in his doorway, watching the world disappear. The farmhouse, the trees, the road, all were erased by a churning wall of white. The wind howled, a physical force that slammed against the hillside. He pushed the heavy oak door shut, dropped the thick bar into place, and the roar of the storm was instantly muted to a distant, muffled shriek. Inside, the silence was profound. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the lamp and the gentle crackle of the fire in the stove. Boro, who would normally be a nervous wreck in a storm, lay curled on the rug before the hearth, sleeping soundly, his flank rising and falling in a slow, easy rhythm. The air was warm and still. Elias sat at his father's table and opened one of the journals. He felt a deep, resonant peace. His father's theory, his own labor, it was all being tested now, at this very moment, by the full fury of the mountain winter, and it was holding. He was safe. This was his home. For 2 days the storm raged without pause. Elias ventured out only once, bundled in every layer of clothing he owned, to check on Patience in her small, sturdy shed, which he'd built into the hillside next to his own dwelling. The wind tore at him, the snow so thick he could barely see 10 feet. It was a world of violent, white chaos. He fed and watered the mule, checked that her shelter was secure, and fought his way back to his door, the short 100-foot journey leaving him breathless and covered in ice. Back inside, he stripped off his frozen outer layers and thawed by the stove, a mug of hot tea in his hands. The thermometer outside his door was gone, likely torn away by the wind, but he knew the temperature had plummeted far below zero. Inside, the thermometer still read 68 degrees. The snow piling up on the roof was now acting as another layer of insulation, just as the journals had predicted. The shelter was not just surviving the storm, it was harnessing it. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally began to subside, though the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy. It was in the unnatural quiet of that afternoon that he heard it, a frantic, muffled pounding. It wasn't at the door, but somewhere on the roof, near the entryway. Boro shot to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand. He listened. The pounding came again, desperate and weak. He grabbed his shovel and pulled on his winter gear. Unbarring the door was difficult. A drift had piled high against it. He had to shove with his entire body, finally managing to open it a crack. He squeezed through and was met with a landscape transformed. The world was a uniform, sculpted white. The snow was piled in massive drifts, some over 15 feet high. His own entryway was at the bottom of a deep canyon of snow. He looked up and saw a figure near where he knew the edge of his roof to be, flailing in the deep powder. He scrambled up the drift, his shovel in hand, and began to dig toward the sound. The snow was light and powdery on top, but heavy and dense underneath. It was exhausting work. Finally, his shovel struck something solid. A boot. He dug faster, clearing the snow away from a man's body. It was Mr. Gable. His face was blue with cold, his beard caked in ice. He was barely conscious. "My wife," Gable whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Barn roof. Collapsed. On the house. We're trapped." Elias didn't waste time with questions. He half carried, half dragged the older man down the slope and through his door, depositing him on the rug in front of the stove. "Stay here," he commanded, pulling a thick quilt over him. Boro, sensing the emergency, licked the man's frozen face. Elias grabbed a coil of rope and his lantern and plunged back into the storm. Following Gable's faint tracks was impossible, but he knew the direction of the farm. He waded through drifts that were chest deep, the world a disorienting swirl of white. It took him nearly an hour to cover the quarter-mile to the Gable property. The scene was one of utter devastation. The massive snow-laden roof of their main barn had given way, its timbers smashing down onto a section of their small farmhouse. Snow was piled everywhere, blocking doors and windows. He found Mrs. Gable in the one remaining corner of the kitchen, huddled by a dead stove, her shawl wrapped around her. She was in shock, her eyes wide and vacant. "He went for help," she murmured. "He went for you." Elias wrapped her in the spare blanket he had carried. "I'm here. We're going back to my place." Getting her back was even harder. She was weak, and he had to support most of her weight, breaking a trail through the crushing snow. They moved yard by painful yard, two small figures against the immense, indifferent power of the storm. When he finally guided her down into the warmth and light of his shelter, she stared, uncomprehending. Her husband was already sipping a hot broth Elias had left on the stove, the color slowly returning to his cheeks. "It's warm," she whispered, the first sign of lucidity returning. She collapsed into the chair Elias offered her. Mr. Gable looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a humility the younger man had never seen before. The mockery was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate gratitude. "The wood stove ran out of fuel yesterday," he said, his voice raspy. "We were burning furniture. We thought we were going to die. I told her, the boy in the hill might be alive. It was the craziest thing I'd ever thought." He looked around the warm, dry room, at the solid stone walls, at the lamplight glinting off the ceiling beams. But it was the only hope we had. Before Elias could respond, another sound came from outside, a faint shout. He went to the door and called out. A voice answered, thin and carried on the wind. "Help! Is anyone there?" Elias went out again, and again. Over the next 5 hours, he became a lifeline. He followed the desperate cries and brought back 2 more families. The Sterlings were the last. He found the wealthy mill owner and his wife and 2 small children huddled in the remains of their grand 2-story house, a structure whose modern design had proven no match for the weight of the snow. The great hall's roof had collapsed, and they were trapped in a single cold room. Sterling, the man of influence and certainty, was reduced to a shivering, frightened father, his fine coat in tatters. He didn't speak as Elias led his family through the snow. He just held his children's hands tightly. When they entered the shelter, Sterling stopped dead, his mouth falling open. The room was now crowded with 17 people, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and relief. The Gables, the Millers, the Petersons. All his neighbors were there, wrapped in blankets, sharing mugs of tea and broth. The space was warm, the light was steady. In the center of the room, Boro moved from person to person, nudging them with his head, offering a quiet, animal comfort. Sterling looked at Elias, his face a complex mask of shame, awe, and gratitude. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elias gestured to the room, to the thick walls and massive beams. "It's 68 degrees, he said simply. There was no triumph in his voice, only fact. The earth keeps it warm. The storm, which would later be known as the Great Blizzard, lasted another full day. For 48 hours, 17 people lived in the hibernaculum. They slept in shifts on the floor. Elias shared all the food he had. There was a quiet, somber sense of community in their shared refuge. All the old certainties, the social hierarchies of the valley, had been buried under 10 feet of snow. Down here, there was only survival and the quiet, stubborn boy who had made it possible. When the sun finally emerged, the world it revealed was silent, white, and broken. Barns and houses across the valley had collapsed. Livestock had frozen. The life they had known was shattered. But they were alive. As the survivors dug themselves out over the following week, Elias's shelter became the recovery headquarters. It was the only intact, warm structure for miles. In the evenings, they would gather there. One night, Mr. Gable stood before the assembled group. "I owe this boy an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Elias. "I mocked you. I called you a fool. I trusted in what I knew, and my knowledge was too small. You didn't argue. You just kept working. You built this ark for us all. I was wrong, Elias. Plain wrong." Mr. Sterling stood up next. "I said your project was an eyesore. I was concerned with appearances and property values while you were concerned with life and death. You listened to a wiser voice. You've shown us all a better way." He looked at the other men. "I propose that, come spring, we learn from Elias. My mill will provide the timber. We will all work together. Every family in this valley should have a place like this, a winter-safe place." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. They looked at Elias not as the strange, orphaned boy, but as a leader, a source of a new, essential wisdom. Elias, uncomfortable with the attention, merely nodded and pulled out one of his father's journals. He laid it on the table. "It's all in here," he said. "He knew. We just have to listen." The years passed. The valley healed and was reborn, stronger and wiser than before. By the 5th year, there were 4 such shelters built into the hillsides, each one a collaboration of community labor, each one based on the diagrams in the journals of the quiet engineer. Elias, no longer a boy, became a teacher. He never boasted. He never said, "I told you so." He simply shared his knowledge, his hands demonstrating the techniques of dry stacking stone, of setting beams, of understanding the slow, powerful breathing of the earth. He married Clara, and their home, the original hibernaculum, became the heart of the community. Their children grew up in its warm, safe embrace, their laughter echoing in the earthen hall. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his amber eyes clouded over. His steps became slow and deliberate. One cold autumn evening, 14 years after the great blizzard, he lay down by the hearth and did not get up again. He rested his head on Elias's lap, gave a soft sigh, and was still. Elias sat with him through the night, one hand resting on the dog's familiar, coarse fur. In the morning, he buried his loyal companion on the grassy knoll of the roof under a small stone marker. He had been a good witness. Elias lived a long and quiet life. He saw his children have children of their own. He saw the valley prosper, its people secure against the harshest winters, their fear replaced by a deep communal preparedness. He became the old man of the valley, his hands gnarled but still strong, his eyes holding the wisdom of one who has seen his quiet convictions reshape the world around him. He died peacefully in his sleep in the same bed he had built over 6 decades earlier, in the warm, silent dark of the house in the hill. They buried him next to Boro on the roof of the home he had built. His gravestone was a single, smooth piece of fieldstone, the kind he had once hauled from the creek bed. The inscription was simple, carved by his eldest son. It did not speak of his heroism or his vision. It said only, Elias, he built a good home. From a distance, the structure was almost invisible, a gentle, wildflower-covered rise in the landscape, indistinguishable from the other hills that rolled toward the horizon. But it was not just a hill. It was a foundation. It was an anchor. It was a legacy of quiet persistence, a testament to the boy who had listened to the earth, and in doing so, had saved them all. The house stood, solid and patient, holding its warmth against the coming cold.